Okay, let's get started. Let me pray. Lord, I just thank you again for the opportunity to assemble to worship you today and to study your word and to study about how we got your word, about translations, and just give me the words to explain it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Yeah. Well, we're starting my favorite part of the course, and that is talking about the philosophical differences between Bible translations. And when you understand these things, then I think you'll be able to go, well, I like this view on this point, this view on that point, this view on this point, which Bible translation follows those things, because they all kind of are a different mixture. And so these are the main things that would make a Bible translation different. And there are points of contention because there's different views on each one of these things. And so do you want a dynamic translation or a more literal, formal translation? Do we take stuff that a New Testament author, he quotes an Old Testament passage? Do I go back to the Old Testament passage and maybe change it to match what the New Testament author understood? Okay. And then the gender inclusive thing is a big issue. And there was an article that came out in 97 about the stealth NIV, and the whole gender thing blew up about that time. And so we're going to go through and talk about that. Do you change brother to brothers and sisters, or do you just leave it brothers? Do you say he, or do you change it to they? And we're not talking gender pronouns. That's a totally new thing. This is just, translation issues. And so there are several famous pastors and theologians out there writing about these issues and kind of saying some things that are divisive. And so we're going to read some of those things today and evaluate them. So we're going to talk about the definition of dynamic and literal, and then we're going to talk about the debate and the things that are being said these days. But first, and I'll tell you that one next. What do you call someone who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual, 2 languages, 1 language, an American. Okay? This whole literal versus dynamic debate only exists in America. Nobody in Europe's arguing about this stuff. Nobody in Africa, Canada, because they all speak multiple languages. And say, no, you can't really have a literal translation. Okay. So what's the difference between a literalist and a kleptomaniac? A literalist takes things literally. A kleptomaniac takes things literally. And while we're talking about kleptomaniacs, how would a sensitive kleptomaniac take things? Personally. Okay. So Dan Wallace says that most laymen today think that a faithful translation of the Bible means a word-for-word translation. If the original has a noun, they expect the noun in the translation. If the original has 16 words, they don't want to see 17 words in the translation. We might call this translation formal equivalence. The King James, Old American Standard, and the New American Standard come closest to this ideal. So if you have a New American Standard or a New King James, what do they do with the words that aren't really in the Greek? They italicize them, right? James tells me that Art Farstad, who was the senior editor of the New King James translation, hated that because we emphasize things by italicizing them. And if somebody didn't read the preface, they might actually think that's the most important word in the verse. But the fact that they would do that shows how tied they were to each word. Okay. And the BibleResearcher.com guy complains that the ESV doesn't italicize the word. So there are people who really do like that. But what a literal translator, the people who are doing literal translations are trying to be word for word. They want to take a Greek sentence and they want to substitute an English word for each Greek word. and move the words around as little as possible so you can kind of still see the structure. Okay. And but they got to make it less confusing. But if it's a little confusing, that's okay because it's Bible English and everybody's used to it, and the pastor will explain it when you go to church. And so, what they want you to think is that they're not making interpretive decisions. They're just translating the words. Okay. Dynamic translation, dynamics equivalence translations interpret what the author meant and then translate it into easy to understand modern English. But to understand what it means you have to look at all the words and the grammar, the syntax, the word order, and look at the whole paragraph, look at the whole book, look at other books by the same author. Okay. And so there's a lot that goes on. If I'm in 1 Thessalonians 1:3, hope of endurance. What does that mean? I need to translate that as enduring hope, NLT, your endurance produced by your hope, CSB and NIV. You know, well, I'm not sure which one, but over in Romans 8:25, he talks about the hope which produces endurance. So, he's probably that's probably what he means, but I'm using something way over here in Romans to help me with 1 Thessalonians. So I have to do that kind of stuff just to translate. Okay. So any questions about the definition? Okay. So what is the disagreement about, the debate about? It's which method of translation is best. And people hold pretty firmly to, their view on this. And some of the stuff that's being said, I think, is divisive. And I'm going to read this today. And this was a lot easier class to teach at the Methodist Church downtown because they'd never heard of John Piper or Wayne Grudem, or maybe even the ESV, because they all use the NRSV. Okay. So my gender inclusive class was harder to teach to them. But so I'm going to quote from these guys, but I've learned a lot from John Piper, his Blazing Center series and other sermons. And we all have read, most of us have read Wayne Grudem's Systematic Theology. I know the ladies reading on Monday nights group. So I hate to do it, but I feel like the stuff that they're saying is just misleading. So Piper says on his website, a more literal translation respects the original author's way of writing. It is a way of honoring the inspired writers. Well, so in Greek class, they start you off in 1 John because that's the easiest. They don't start you in 1 Peter because that's one of the hardest. Okay. So how am I going to honor Peter? Make it harder to understand? He's got worse word order. I mean, if I'm just translating the words, I'm not quite even sure how that works, how you make it sound like the author. But that's what he's saying. Translators are fallible and they may mislead the English reader if they use unnecessary paraphrases to bring out one possible meaning and conceal others. Well, a paraphrase is saying the same thing in the same language. It's not translating, okay? So I think what he may be saying is if it uses too many words, if it's, dare I say, good English, that you might mislead, you have to make interpretive decisions to put it into better English, okay? And if you do that, if you don't just translate the word, then you may make a mistake. And it kind of implies that if you just translate the words, you won't make a mistake. Number 3, more literal translation gives preachers more confidence that they can preach what the English text says with authority that it reflects what the original Greek or Hebrew text says. So he can't preach from authority from the NIV or the NLT or the NET, right? But Chuck Swindoll preached from all three. Those were his 3 most used translations. So I don't know why he would say that. A more literal translation which preserves ambiguities that are really there in the original keeps open the possibility of new insight by future Bible readers. I have to recognize that this Greek word is being used is ambiguous. And then I have to go, what can I do in English to pass this ambiguity along? I don't just go look up the first dictionary definition of the word and plop it in there, and I'm going to preserve the ambiguity. But he's trying to make it sound like he's the one who's doing the interpreting. If the translation will just translate the words, then he can do it. So actually, all three of these, second, third, and fourth point, are all the same exact things said with different words. So what we have is three unnecessary paraphrases, warning us against using unnecessary paraphrases. He goes on to say, I do not claim that the ESV is without its own level of paraphrasing. Some will always be necessary, and there will always be disagreements about how much is necessary. I am simply arguing that the ESV is the best balance available of readability and literalness. I hope that it becomes the standard for the church. So paraphrasing is bad, but even the ESV has to do it sometimes. But he does notice that there's a problem with readability if you get too literal. And he goes on another place on his site. He goes, here is the problem we have had for almost 30 years in the English-speaking world. The New International Version has become the most popular modern translation of the Bible in the evangelical church. But the NIV is very much of a paraphrase rather than a more literal translation. When I first read it in 1975, I knew I could never teach or preach from it because of how much interpretation it does that I think the reader should do, not the translator. I really don't think that the NIV is the problem that we've had for 30 years. But that's, again, I think a divisive statement. This is another guy. This website doesn't even exist anymore, but I copied and pasted it long ago. The primary difference between each translation is how literal it is and how close it is to the original version. This is important because the inspired word of God is the original version in Greek and Hebrew. If the translation we use strays away from that version, we are getting a distorted version of God's perfect word. The graphic below shows how close the common English translations available are to the original Bible. More literal means they are nearly word for word. Less literal means they are more thought for thought. The word for word translations are always better, but there is a balance with readability. So it's kind of the same stuff, but this is the standard argument for literal translations. But somehow thought for thought is bad, and I don't understand that. But he recognizes that it's harder to read. And then he gives us this diagram that shows where the Bibles fit on the literal and dynamic scale. And I think it's pretty accurate. Now, the ESV preface says, the ESV is an essentially literal translation that seeks as far as possible to capture the precise wording of the original text and the personal style of each Bible writer. As such, its emphasis is on word-for-word correspondence, at the same time taking into account differences of grammar, syntax, and idiom between current literary English and the original languages. Thus, it seeks to be transparent to the original text, letting the reader see as directly as possible the structure and meaning of the original. Again, emphasis is on word for word. And, transparent to the original text. In contrast to the ESV, some Bible versions have followed a thought for thought rather than a word for word translation philosophy, emphasizing dynamic equivalence rather than the essentially literal meaning of the original. A thought for thought translation is of necessity more inclined to reflect the interpretive opinions of the translator and the influences of contemporary culture. Yes, ma'am.
Could you go back a couple of slides to a diagram where you had the different versions of the Bible? I can't see those. Can you just read them out like the?
Oh, okay. So far left is New American Standard. Then below that is the ESV. And then up above is King James Version. And down below, New King James. Up above is Holman Christian Standard. And then down below is the Net. And then right above that is the NIV. Then to the right is NLT. And then the Message.
Thank you.
Okay. So do you get the idea that thought for thought is bad, word for word is good? But what is thought for thought? Meaning, right? So translating the meaning is bad, but translating the essentially literal meaning is good. That's kind of confusing. That's kind of contradictory. If you say something to someone, don't you want them to understand what you're thinking? Right? What your words mean? Have you ever had someone say, well, that's what you said? Well, that's not what I meant. Well, did they take your words too literally? Right? Like this guy. So, therapist, what brought you to here? Her. I just hate how he takes things so literally. Therapist, what about you? A car. Okay. I was actually working on the PowerPoint and stepped away, looked at Facebook. This popped up on my Facebook, and I'm going, okay, not only is Big Brother watching, he's being helpful. But anyway. Oh, let's see. Let's go back to the last sentence. A thought-for-thought translation is of necessity more inclined to reflect the interpretive opinion of the translator and the influences of contemporary culture. That's what we're going to look at over the next few weeks. Lots of examples, because that's just not true. You have to interpret whether you're going to put it in Bible English or dynamic English. And this influences of contemporary culture, he's got to be talking about the gender inclusive issues. And a more literal NRSV has been more influenced by the gender issues than the more dynamic NET, NIV, and NLT. So that's not true either. Here's another chart. I guess you probably can't read that either, but this guy has expanded all the way to literal. He has extra categories. And it's got the basic same presentation of where the Bibles are on the scale. But again, I want to point this out because he's got hard to read, high up there on the left, and accurate all the way out here on the right. Okay, so he would say that Young's literal translation is the most accurate. It's also the hardest to read. Okay, I've never seen it, but I've heard it's bad. And then the CSB has a chart. I went to a meeting with the Global Bible Initiative guys, the president of Zondervan in Grand Rapids in 2018, and they showed me this chart.
What's CSB stand for?
Christian Standard Bible. It was the Holman Christian Standard Bible. And so they've got, again, easy to read and then literal. So this is their chart. The more literal it is, the more accurate, the easier it is to read, the less accurate. And so they come out in the middle. And we'll come back to this in a second. So they say on their website before they show that graphic that their goal is to leave no aspect of the original language text unaccounted for in translation, and to render the text using natural English that is as easily comprehended as possible. They go on to say this twofold commitment expresses our understanding of biblical accuracy, which is often mistakenly equated with literalness. A literal translation that is difficult to understand or even misleading to modern readers is not accurate. So I think those are great goals, and I do think that the CSB is very easy to understand. But if they think that literal translations or it's misleading to modern readers because that doesn't make it more accurate, then why would they make this chart? And so I talked to one of the guys that made the chart, and he said that, well, you can't convince the whole world thinks literal is more accurate. So you got to prove some way that you're the best blend of literal and dynamic. And so he said that it was impossible to change that. And I said, well, that's my new mission in life. So we'll see. You'll be my test subject. We'll have a poll when we're done. Again, what do all of the pro-literal people agree? That it's harder to understand. Okay, so they're trying to make theirs the best. They come up with something called optimal equivalence. They're not formal, they're not dynamic, they're optimal. So they are the easiest to read of all the hard to read translations. Right? That's what they said. So I thought of an analogy. I go to the furniture store and I ask the salesman, I'd like to buy a chair. And he goes, well, here's all our uncomfortable chairs. Okay. And this is the most comfortable of all the uncomfortable chairs. Would you buy that chair? What if he said, these chairs are better for your back? And of all these uncomfortable chairs, this is the most comfortable. Those comfortable chairs over here, they're not good for your back. Well, then you might actually buy an uncomfortable chair, right? So what if he just makes more money selling the uncomfortable chairs because nobody wants those? And so he's not really telling you the truth. And you could actually buy a comfortable chair. It probably is better for your back because it's comfortable. Okay. So that might be what's going on here. If literal translations are not more accurate and they're harder to understand, then maybe you don't need to buy one. So the Legacy Study Bible has this on their website. As an update of the New American Standard, the LSB is a literal word-for-word translation. Particularly, it aims to be a window into the original text by having precision in two ways. First, it seeks to ensure that each word and phrase in English corresponds to each word and phrase in the original languages, relative to meaning and grammar. Second, it also seeks to ensure that the same words and phrases correspond to each other within the translation as much as possible. This provides the reader confidence that the word or phrase they see in one place is indeed the same they see elsewhere. Because Bible translation and interpretation belongs in the context of the local church, the LSB does not shy away from being as literal as possible, trusting that the community of believers will be able to teach and explain the passages to one another. So what they're saying is that everywhere they see the Greek word sarx, they're going to put the English word flesh. Okay. And so you will, even if it doesn't make sense in that context, it was good. They haven't seen my face in the flesh, Colossians 2:1. Right. So that's not a very good way to say that. I think that we all would understand what it means, but I find it interesting at the end here, they said, they're as literal as possible, trusting that the community of believers will be able to teach and explain the passages to one another. So a new Christian reading this is not going to understand a lot of it, and we'll have to go to church and have the pastor explain it to them. But they're okay with that. That they think it's that important to be literal. So that kind of gives you the idea of some of the things that are being said to promote literal translations. Any questions?
If the NASB ranks higher than the ESV in literalness,
What?
if the NASB ranks higher than the ESV in being a literal translation, why isn't everyone just reading the NASB? It's even higher than King James.
I don't know. Actually, the CSB chart showed the ESV was the most literal, and they did it with a computer analysis. I don't know how the computer figured it out, but yeah.
I can give a partial answer to that, and that the people that own the copyright for the NASB were very, very unreasonable to work with, and they have very high royalties, higher than anybody. And so, if you're going to have to pay a ton of royalties for it,
Mm-hmm.
and they're hard to work with, you're not gonna use it in your commentaries, your Christmas cards. you
That's-
know, everything else.
That's a good point. ESV,
So it kind of shot itself in the foot in
Yeah.
the seventies and never really recovered.
I think the ESV's done a way better job of that. Much easier to work with. Yeah. Yeah, good point. Somebody else?
It seems we're kind of like missing a word. For like the different aspects, because. It kind of makes sense what they're saying, right? Like, we all kind of scoff at the message because it's so whatever,
Yes.
but. But we're saying. But we're saying we don't want literal translation, but we do want the most accurate understanding of what the text is. So it just seems like we're missing a word in our language, when we're talking about language. To make the proper distinctions in what we're talking about.
Yeah, I can see
Like our
that.
definitions aren't clear enough,
Mhm.
because. Like when you read it, I'm like, well, I get what they're saying, but I get how we can kind of also laugh at it because it's, or not laugh, but like critique it because it.
Mhm.
But I get they're trying, I mean. I don't know, it just seems like we're somehow missing a word that could be better used than. The
Then-
words we have.
Yeah. You mean like as in literal versus formal versus dynamic? Yeah,
Or just like, yeah, right.
right. Yeah,
The accurate, right, we want the accuracy, and we know that people are still gonna have different understandings of the text, right? Like, people are still gonna argue about baptism this, baptism that, like.
Right.
You're not, so they don't want commentaries on. They don't want.
True.
They don't want the translation to be a comment.
yes, and the NLT
So
does
that's
a
like-
little,
But there's not, but it's hard, but there's not a good word, it seems
Right.
like.
yeah. The NLT does a little bit more of that. We'll see some examples later on where they're adding some words that aren't in the text. But I mean, the ESV does it too. We're going to look at one in a minute. Actually, after this slide.
Whether they're both accurate.
Yes, I think that's the main question. And they are both accurate. Your literal translation is accurate if you can understand it. If you don't understand it, it's not accurate. Okay? This is not the same thing as reading a technical doctor thing that you don't understand. That could be accurate without you understanding it. But if it's not English and you don't understand it, that somehow that we've been trained to think that that's accurate, but I don't think it is. Okay.
I don't know, I guess I'm trying to understand what you're saying here. You're saying that if we don't understand the text, it's not accurate, but the accuracy of the text is not determined by someone's understanding or misunderstanding.
No, you're correct. The text, the Greek and Hebrew is accurate. Our translation's not accurate if we didn't pass along what the Greek and Hebrew meant. Okay. We've got some words there, and if you dig hard enough, you might figure out what it means, but you shouldn't have to dig that hard. Yeah. No.
I think a good example is if we think of stuff that's not the Bible, it's easier to understand the conflict. So like if a book, like let's say a fantasy novel or something was originally written in French and it gets an English translation, but in the original French, there's all these French idioms that we don't even have in English, right? Like
Right.
Sayings or something that they all know. Like how we have sayings like a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? And maybe that's one that would kind of come across easy in a literal translation, but there's lots of them that would not, right? They'd be like, well, what's that mean? And so you just have to pick an English idiom that means the same thing as the French idiom, but they're not going to be the same words at all, right?
Correct.
But you
And
get the meaning.
I would agree with you mostly, except we're dealing with the word of God and every word is inspired. So we want to make sure that we account for that. And we've got, Strong's numbers, and every word has got a, Strong's number, and we do word studies. And so there's more to the biblical text, in figuring out what it means. So
Sometimes there's
Yeah.
problems with just our own definitions, and literal is a key one. I've been in some theological debates where hundreds of pastors arguing over something. And they'll come down and say, do you mean literal as in good literature? Because the Bible's literature's got poetic, or do you mean it literal as an absolute concrete? And sometimes when I see these guys debate, if they would substitute another word,
Mhm.
like, I mean that absolutely, I don't mean that, or I mean it not woodenly, or I
Right.
mean it concretely. So there's other words that sometimes substitute for literal.
Yes.
Get the idea across. Because literal is a word that comes from literature. And
Yeah.
it has at least
Well,
two definitions that I know of.
I was so embarrassed. I literally died.
Yes, you do.
I mean, no, I didn't really, but that's how we talk, right? Okay. Bill Mounts. He's a Greek professor, has the #1 most popular basic Greek grammar that everybody uses in seminary. He was on the NIV and the ESV committee. I think he's the one who told me he had 8 hours to work on Romans. There's no such thing as a literal meaning of a word. What does logos literally mean? No such thing as a literal translation of a verse. And there's therefore no such thing as a literal translation or even an essentially literal translation. Even interlinears are technically not literal, but are to some degree interpretive. The minute you translate to theou as of God, you are no longer literal, but interpreting a genitive noun construction with a prepositional phrase and dropping ha, a word that actually has no precise equivalent in English. No competent translator should say that their translation is literal. The problem is that the folks in our churches mistakenly equate literal with word for word and think that means accurate. It's our responsibility to help people see the error in this thinking. So what does the word logos mean? In verse 18, it says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. Well, that's the word logos, right? But that's really not very good English. The word of the cross. The NIV has the message of the cross. The Net Bible has the message about the cross. And so in this situation, logos doesn't actually just mean word. It means the message, okay? While we're there, I noticed that in verse 17, the RSV and the ESV say, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power, I was in church, a conference at the end of the year, and this was the passage the pastor was preaching from. And his whole message was about the cross being emptied of its power. And I'm looking at the net and it just says it's useless. I'm like, oh, of its power is not in the Greek. So why they stick those words in? I think it's fine that they stuck those words in. It explains what it's being emptied of. I wondered why the net didn't put, something like that. The NASB has void, okay? So they're interpreting what it's being emptied of and they're adding that to the text. And I think that's fine that they did that there. But that's an interpretive decision that you just have to figure out what these things mean. So you have to think about everything when you're translating. When somebody says, can an AI do a Bible translation? I'm like, there is no way. You've got so much to think about. Mark Strauss wrote a book called Distorting Scripture, which was primarily about the gender issue, but he spent quite a bit of time on literal versus dynamic. He said it should be clear that the primary goal of a good translation must always be meaning rather than form. Indeed, though we speak of a translation debate between these two methodologies, from the perspective of linguists and international Bible translators, the debate was over long ago. The technical writings and research emerging from major international translation organizations like Wycliffe and the United Bible Society view it as a given that dynamic or functional equivalence is the only legitimate method of true translation. Precise formal equivalence is little more than imitation of a source language's form, not true translation into a receptor language. Evangelical scholar D.A. Carson noted in 1987 that as far as those who struggle with biblical translation are concerned, dynamic equivalence has won the day, and rightly so. That was 38 years ago. Unfortunately, the debate is not over. And I think it continues because we have a lot of English versions. And I said it in the first class. Marketing departments have to, come up with something that distinguishes their translation. The CSB says you've got formal versus dynamic. We're optimal, okay? The ESV is saying dynamic's not as accurate. Literal is more accurate. Okay, and so not that they're lying, it's they firmly believe what they are saying, but I question whether or not it's true. So now I want to, well, any questions? I'm going to take a passage and we're going to read what Wayne Grudem says about it.
Is there a concern when talking about dynamic versus literal, when you're translating something from one modern spoken language to another? It's a lot easier to get the meaning across, to ask a native speaker, what does this mean? What is this idiom? It's a lot harder with so-called dead languages.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so I can understand a concern of misinterpreting things like that we have no way of actually knowing what they meant to the reader of the.
Well, that was why the secular manuscripts help when you have a word that's only used once in the New Testament or the Old Testament, and they can figure things out like that. But
the danger with the dynamic equivalence, and this came to play in Colombia with my parents. They were translating into an unwritten and an unspoken language, creating the whole thing. And Wycliffe, SIL down there, was saying, fast, 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 we gotta bring in the kingdom, we've gotta get the Bibles out there, fast, fast. And so they said, we're gonna, basically, you're taking too long giving an accurate, they don't know what a lamb is. They don't understand God. So Christ is going to be a pig because they know what a pig is. And Jesus is going to be Humanihinku, which is a god of the forest. But he's a horrible trickster god. Terrible, terrible god. But the people knew what these things were. And so they said, we won't have to try to go through the problem of teaching Christ. We won't have to go to the problem of teaching a lamb and all of that. Just put these in and get this Bible out there. And so mom and dad said, well, we can't do that. And they left, and their translation was then taken by somebody who put all that stuff in there. So the Cubeo Indians have a translation. Jesus Christ is this trickster God, the pig of God.
that sounds terrible.
It's horrible. But that's some of the danger of rushing through with that.
Oh, yeah.
Dynamic equivalence is much harder.
Huh?
Literal. Dynamic equivalence is much more difficult than literal. So if you're gonna rush it, that's what's gonna happen. It just has to be done.
I'm not saying we rush it. I mean, you spend hours on each verse.
I just want to say that the Greek culture was a highly literary culture. We have writings in Greek going back to 1000 BC. In addition to that, we've got the spread of Koine Greek by Alexander the Great in the whole Mediterranean world. We have tons of literature outside the Bible in Greek, and there's probably not one. I don't think there's one word or idiom in Greek that we don't know with me.
Right.
There's just so much writing, even though it is a dead language, that form of Greek, obviously, but we know what all the words, the Greek words, the Hebrew, I can't say exactly the same thing.
Right.
But for Greek, it's just,
well, and
there's really no question. We know what these words mean.
Yeah, and then you're pointing out the preservation thing that we talked about. I mean,
right.
We
I'm saying that
we can be
broad
and
so vast.
Yeah. We can be very accurate. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to give an example. This passage is 1 Kings 2:10. David passed away and was buried in the city of David. That's the net. NLT, David died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. NIV, David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. ESV, David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the gender inclusive NRSV, David slept with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. So Wayne Grudem says, some details are missing in the NLT Stop for Thought translation of 1 Kings 2:10. This dynamic equivalence translation does not include the idea of sleeping as a rich metaphor for death, a metaphor in which there is a veiled hint of someday awakening from that sleep to a new life. The expression slept with his fathers also includes a faint hint of a corporate relationship with David's ancestors who had previously died and are awaiting a future resurrection. But that is also missing from the dynamic equivalence translation, then David died. Yes, the NLT translated the main idea into contemporary English, but isn't it more accurate to translate all the words of the Hebrew original, including the word shakab, which means to lie down, rest, sleep, the word im, which means with, the word ab, which means father, or in the plural, fathers, since these words are in the Hebrew text as well. When these words are translated, not just the main idea, but also more details of the meaning of the Hebrew original are brought over into English. When I first read that, I went and looked at the net and went, oh my goodness, we've messed this up. I started to call Hall Harris and say, Hall, should we change this? But then I went and looked up the Hebrew word shakab. It doesn't just mean to lie down and rest and sleep. It actually just means to get horizontal. It's mostly used of death, having sex, and sometimes it's used of going to sleep. But that's not real important because everybody goes to sleep every night. So the Bible's not going to record that. So I don't know why he didn't mention that, but the context is going to determine what it means. And since he was buried, the context in his passage is that he died. The Hebrew does not say David slept with his fathers. That's an English translation of the Hebrew lie down, right? And so it's not a rich metaphor. It's just a euphemism. It's this way of softening the harshness of death. So there's no future idea of future resurrection inherent in the word slept. If I told you I killed my dog yesterday, that would sound terrible. So I would say, I put my dog to sleep yesterday. Would you think that he's going to be resurrected because I said that? No. Okay. So I spent quite a bit of time trying to track down where the sleep came from, and I think it's from Jerome in the Vulgate. So there's a lexical problem, the dictionary problem. Yeah, Jim.
Could you go back to the parallel, the different versions? Yeah, there. So there's a bigger problem with the NLT than the rest of them.
Well, that's just what he's writing against.
I know, but actually he wasn't buried with his ancestors.
Oh no, I'm going to get to that in a couple classes. Okay. You're ahead of me. So the lexical problem is that he's got the definition wrong. The theological problem is that he's reading New Testament believers only sleep theology back into this passage. Okay, he says we're not at the mercy of the translators' interpretive theological opinion, but in this case, I think we are. And I actually found places where they quote these dozen or so First Kings and Second Kings slept with his fathers to prove that believers only sleep. Okay, but there's also a logical problem. Why didn't he say this about Ahab or Omri or Jeroboam? Why did he only say what he said about David? Because they all slept with their fathers. Are they all going to be resurrected and reunited? Is that what this passage is really teaching? No, in fact, this word for word translation has led people to think that this is a resurrection passage. And so if I'm aware, especially if I'm aware, that that's being misunderstood, then it's my responsibility as a translator to say David died so there's no confusion. Because there's not more meaning by translating all the words. So that makes sense? Any questions? Okay. Next week we'll start talking about idioms and word meanings, and we're going to do some translating. So thank you.